There's still, we're all good Catholics, I see. There's still some seats here in the front for those of you who'd like to maybe not stand for the entire event. There are some seats available. I'd like to ask Father Tony Pogerels, fellow at the Life Cycle Institute, to open today with the prayer. Tony?
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Gracious God, we give you thanks for bringing us all together from many places in this city of Washington. We pray that you may be with us and help us to listen. We pray for our speakers, that you may help them to wisely articulate their perspectives. And we pray for all of us here, that we may listen to one another respectfully, that we may indeed engage in dialogue, and that we may work with all, those who share our perspectives, those who share different ones, that we may work together for the common good of your people. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thanks, Father Tony. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Schneck. I'm the director of the Life Cycle Institute, and welcome to Catholic University, and welcome to our symposium on the Obama administration and the Catholic social agenda. We are really honored to have so many people here today. Thank you all for coming. The Life Cycle Institute has as its mission the academic analysis of those public policies that concern Catholic social thought. Today's panel, accordingly, comes right from the heart of that particular mission. You might ask, though, what is behind Catholic social thought and behind all the teachings of the Church that inform it? At one point, I thought, as I mused on this, I thought that it came down to a fairly simple, single idea. As the words of the old hymn put it, ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est. Where charity and love, there also is God. But engaging caritas in the world of policy and politics, I should say my other hat is as a political science professor, well, a different kettle of fish. Thomas Aquinas tells us the jewel of policy virtues is prudentia, prudence, whereby the moral imperative is to achieve what is actually possible given the crooked timber of humanity. So while thinking about this, while Catholic social teaching is all about charity and love, prudence is the virtue that affects it in the world. Catholic social teaching depends on prudence. With prudence, we are obliged to pursue what is possible for the common good. Accordingly, while we must speak out stridently against moral error in this administration, as in every administration, we are also obliged to work prudentially with what opportunities we have to achieve what good we can. Given the extraordinary demands of the hour on our consciences, as formed by Catholic social teachings, it would be a tragic error, I believe, for Catholics to stay on the sidelines. But I'm lecturing. I apologize. Get an old professor near a microphone and you know what happens. Ladies and gentlemen, the Life Cycle Institute is proud to welcome you to this discussion of the Obama administration and the Catholic social agenda. Bill?
Thank you very much, Steve, for that welcome. I'm Bill Barbieri from the School of Theology and Religious Studies here. Very pleased to welcome all of you today, as well as our distinguished panel as we take on our topic today of the Obama administration and the Catholic social agenda. Steve, I appreciate in particular your mention of the virtues relevant to Catholic teaching. I think that they are very much on the agenda today, especially if we switch gears and talk for a moment about the theological virtues, including one on which the incoming President Obama has already, I think, staked a claim to some credentials. I'm thinking of hope. Hope has become associated with his name. What remains to be seen in his administration is how some of those other virtues fare. Faith. Will he be faithful to the agenda that he's outlined during his candidacy and as he takes office? And how about charity? I think we'll hear some more about these things from our panel, which in itself embodies many virtues. I would like to welcome and I introduce our panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. First of all, John Steinbrunner here. He is Professor of Public Policy at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. I'll say that more about him in a moment. Then we have Dr. Marianne Cusimano-Love from our own Department of Politics. Next is Dr. Leslie Woodcock-Tendler. And she, too, is from our Department of History. Or your chair at the moment, is it? Oh, no, you've graduated from being chair. My apologies. And finally, from over across town, our sister institution, Father John Langan from the Department of Philosophy at the Kennedy Institute at Georgetown University. The charge that we have given our distinguished panelists is to, first of all, reflect on the implications of the incoming administration for various aspects of Catholic social teaching, the Catholic social agenda. We have somewhat artificially divvied up the topics and given our first two speakers the international sphere, the global sphere, issues such as war and peace or security, the environment, poverty, and globalization. They will speak to those issues from their respective backgrounds and disciplines. Then we have for our other two panelists issues such as domestic issues, such as life issues, poverty reduction in the U.S., issues of the day such as immigration. We've asked, as part of their charge, the panelists to reflect from their own disciplines, whether it be as a historian or a social ethicist, political theorist, or an international relations specialist. We'll begin, without further ado, with our first speaker. He is John Steinbrunner from the University of Maryland, the Center for International and Security Studies there. Before he took up that position, he was Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution for something over 15 years, I believe. He has had teaching stints at august institutions such as Harvard and Yale and MIT before his most recent stations. He has published prolifically. Some of his books are The Cybernetic Theory of Decision, New Dimensions of Political Analysis, and Principles of Global Security. And his other writings include some interesting titles. I'll mention just a couple of them. One of them enlists a virtue that Steve just mentioned. He wrote a piece called Problems of Prudence, Nuclear Explosives, Biotechnology, and Global Warming. He's written on biotechnology, space security, and here are just a few more titles to give you a sample of his work. Potentially Constructive Implications of Disaster in Iraq. What remains a timely topic on the agenda. U.S. and Iranian leaders walk through minefields over nuclear impasse. That's an issue that we'll be continuing to hear about. And finally, biological weapons, a plague on all houses. Dr. Steinbrunner has written as well for Catholic publications, Catholic Online, America. Please welcome Dr. Steinbrunner.
I'm going to try to keep me and that screen on the same page and forgiveness for the mistakes I'm about to make in my work. Let me begin by saying that although I'm happy to speak about the Obama administration, I certainly don't speak for them. And although I know many of the people who have been involved, I personally have not been. just in case there's any ambiguity about that. There probably won't be when you hear what I'm about to say. And let me also note just before I start that I have a son who, while he's a professional actor, does public speaking coaching, and he's been pinging on me for some time to summarize at the start what you're going to say. And so that's why I start with this first slide. If I can figure out how to get it up there. There. That says, in brief, what I want to say. And it is that nuclear weapons and global warming are in a sense in a league by themselves in terms of both impending public policy problems and moral considerations. They are, I would argue, the leading issues of our time because of the consequence to human societies that is represented. And these two are a good bit more intimately connected than is generally realized. Okay. I'm still summarizing the message here. It's vitally important, I believe, for everyone to develop the implications, and they will involve a stretching of thinking of virtually everyone. These issues go far beyond what we're familiar with. It is reasonable to expect that the Obama administration will be responsive. However, it's important for the Catholic community and all other communities as well not to wait for that responsiveness, but to actively promote it. And in fact, the degree to which they are truly responsive will depend a lot on initiative from groups like this. Let me begin then with a few comments about nuclear weapons and remind you of the 1983 pastoral letter, which I trust is basically familiar to all of you. That letter, that many years ago, provided only provisional moral approval for the practice of deterrence and struggled with inherent moral objection to it and practical accommodation. But in the interim, that process continues right up to the moment, essentially unaltered. As we speak, American and Russian forces are maintaining, as they continuously do, thousands of nuclear weapons on alert status, programmed for mass attacks to be initiated within really a few minutes and completed within a few hours. This programming is done independent of any immediate requirement, emission requirement, and it continuously puts tens of millions of people at risk. And those are hard facts that the Catholic bishop struggled with in 1983 and is still a struggle, I think. Whether or not that force configuration was justifiable under Cold War conditions in 1983, there was a spectrum of opinion about that. It is certainly not at the moment. I don't think any individual, using whatever moral principle, on their own, would say that this is a justifiable arrangement. Whatever residual deterrent effect we really need can be achieved by dramatically lower levels of destructive potential. The fact is that the operational coupling of the American and the Russian forces continued essentially unaltered from the Cold War period, creates the possibility of an inadvertent or deliberately created catastrophe of monumental proportions. And it entails a risk of terrorist exploitation, and that there is no good reason to continue to do that. And I think it is, again, very difficult, although you will discover, as the President will discover, is that people within the establishment assert the necessity of continuing to do that. I think very few individuals bringing independent judgments to bear would endorse that. Sorry, I keep going the wrong direction. There is an obviously superior configuration of nuclear forces, which is technically feasible, and that is simply to remove them from their delivery systems, put them in secure storage, continuously monitored. And the continuous monitoring would be important to preserve any sort of breakout surprise attack, which the strategic theorists would worry about. That configuration would essentially eliminate the threat or the possibility of inadvertent catastrophe. It would provide an accurate account of global inventory. Eventually it would. At the moment, the United States does not claim to know within 5,000 how many nuclear weapons exist globally. That is a very large number, and there is no excuse for that this deep into the nuclear era. Our uncertainty has mostly to do with our estimate of Russian inventory, but the facts are we don't know the global total. Nobody knows the global total. The arrangement would put us on would help, not by itself, but would help the lengthy process of providing an accurate global account, which would, of course, be a necessary condition for any effort for ultimate elimination. It would provide higher standards of physical security against terrorist access, and it would support any reasonable return requirement by allowing the provision of the forces to be brought out of storage if there should ever be any plausible immediate need. Admittedly, as the specialist would be quick to point out, there would be issues of trust in transitioning to such a configuration. But I would argue, at a minimum, it is clear that it is both a moral and a practical imperative to begin to explore the possibility. In the first instance with Russia, there has been no discussion, basically, with Russia about the possibility of systematically removing weapons from alert. And ultimately with all the other states that actively deploy nuclear weapons. That would have to be our initiative because we are, as everybody recognizes, by far the strongest power. Let me then shift to global warming. And without going into any elaborate detail, just say that the basic problem is that, again, using that phrase, that very important phrase, prudence, a prudent limitation of the possibility of catastrophic climate change would require a dramatic transformation of energy generating technology from 20% reliance on basically non-carbon emitting sources. At the moment, that's roughly what it is, to 80% by 2050 in order to establish, if you will, a limitation on the process of global warming. But as we are accomplishing that, as I think the Catholic bishops have been very eager to point out, we must assure equitable economic development so that poor or populations have some rise in standard of living. And the implication of that is that we're going to have to expand total energy generation by a factor of 2 to 3 while we are transforming the basis of it from 20% to 80% non-carbon emitting sources. That, you could argue, is the biggest investment problem in all of human history, not yet organized. There are 5 basic technologies that could, in principle, contribute to that transformation. I won't stop to try to review and comment on all of them. But the bottom line, and it is very, very unlikely that the requirement can be met without a substantial expansion of nuclear power generation, probably on the order of 5 to 10 times what it currently is. All done by 2050 if we're going to meet the prudential standard. For such an expansion to occur safely at acceptable cost, there would have to be new reactor designs. We're not going to do that on the basis of current light water reactor designs. There are, in principle, such designs, but they're not ready for not being developed. There would have to be internationalized control of the fuel cycle. There would have to be termination of active deterrent force operations and a general transformation of security relationships among the U.S., the EU, Russia, and China, and India at a minimum in order to provide an adequate basis for safely expanding nuclear power generation on that scale. It is feasible, technically and socially, but it is, to put it mildly, extremely demanding. Pursuit of that agenda, then I would argue, is a comparably strong practical and moral imperative. which intersects the deactivation of nuclear weapons, the other major issue, and requires primary initiative from the United States with the greatest assets relevant to these two issues. That initiative, I think, is yet to be taken in any real sense. Let me, because Marianne told me to do so, let me speak briefly about the Iranian situation. Again, very assertive terms. I think should be clear to everyone that constructive engagement with Iran is almost certainly a necessary condition for accomplishing what the Catholic bishops have said needs to happen, which is responsible transition in order to stabilize both Iraq and Afghanistan. In order to accomplish a responsible transition in Iraq, we will have to engage constructively with Iran. Of course, we have no relations at the moment and have not had for 30 years. Just talking to them is not going to do the trick. To have the kind of understanding required to contain, if you will, their nuclear material production activities, there would have to be security assurances from the United States, i.e. we will not attack if they don't, and we won't let friends attack either. That we would guarantee access to nuclear fuel cycle services from the international community generally. That's all that phrase means, depoliticized access to fuel cycle services. That in order to, and in exchange for these assurances, Iran would be asked, and must be asked actually, to contain their enrichment program short of weapons potential and to subject any product that they do produce to international control, not only to deal with the Iranian situation, but to set a new standard for international behavior generally in anticipation of the need to develop an entirely different arrangement with regard to the global warming problem. Development of that agenda, then I would finally argue, would be a natural accompaniment to the nuclear weapons and global warming agenda. These then are the issues that I would urge you to contemplate, and not only to contemplate, but be active about, both as a moral and as a practical imperative. And it is going to require public activism. The government is not going to do these, even led by the most hopeful figure that we've seen in some time. The government is not going to come up with this by its own. It's going to need very active encouragement to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Steinbruner. We will proceed through the individual presentations and then devote a little bit of time to any exchanges among the members of the panel that they would like to engage in. As I said, they do overlap in their respective competencies, and then we will, I think, have ample time to open up the discussion to questions and comments from the audience. Our next speaker is our very own Dr. Marianne Cusimano-Love, one of the most popular instructors certainly in our Peace Studies program that we have here on campus, and one of the few people you'll find whose website has images like a teddy bear clambering over a book on international relations beyond sovereignty. That juxtaposition of images, I think, says something about Marianne's diverse career. She is a well-loved and very successful professor of politics here on campus who moonlights. She doesn't get to sleep because she has small children, but she moonlights as a children's book author. Her academic publications include the aforementioned Beyond Sovereignty, Issues for a Global Agenda, and Morality Matters, Ethics and the War on Terrorism. She is a fellow member with Dr. Steinbruner of the Council on Foreign Relations. She has numerous involvements beyond the university, including as a consultant with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and she's on the board for the Jesuit Refugee Service. She has been instrumental in the construction over the last few years of what is turning into a global Catholic peace-building network. Please welcome Dr. Marianne Cusimano-Love.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you all for joining us in this close quarters. There is one more seat here. If somebody from the back wants to come up, but it'll be embarrassing getting you. We've been asked to talk about the Obama administration and the Catholic social agenda, and I think I have the easiest part of our docket today because I have the area in which there's some good news to report. I think Leslie and John will have the harder issues in talking about the disparities between the church on pro-life issues and the domestic agenda. But there's some good news to report in the foreign policy area, and that's what I'll be talking. I wanted to start with a quote: "We must become, for people all over the world, a witness to hope." Now, if this was my undergraduate class, I might do a quiz and ask, who said that? Was it President Barack Obama? And you might think that it would be. But actually, those words are not from the President's memoir, The Audacity of Hope, but from Pope Benedict XVI's second encyclical, Saved in Hope. So I'd like to return to that at the end of my comments today, because I think there's actually an important intersection here in the policies and the outlook of these two powerful figures. So what can we hope for in the policies of the new administration, and what common ground may there be between Benedict's vision of hope and Obama's, perhaps, and our political agendas? The Obama administration is pursuing very different principles, policies, and processes in foreign policy, and positions that dramatically realign U.S. foreign policy much more engaged in line with the positions of the Catholic Church. So on the topics that I'll be talking about on peace, poverty, globalization, the war on terror, etc., there's been a real realignment that's in much closer relation with the Church. In principles, the new administration discusses and has already moved towards the rule of law, the rights of man, and the responsibilities of the rich to work alongside the poor. And we've been asked to talk about what elements of the inaugural speech identify those principles. And I think probably the line is, as for our common defense, we reject as false the choice between our safety and our ideals. That was a line from the Obama inaugural speech. It could easily have been a line from the Catholic bishops or from the Vatican on how to pursue concerns about safety in an era of terrorism. He goes on to say that our founders assured a rule of law and the rights of man, and those ideals still light the world, and we will not give them up for expedience' sake. Our power comes not just from missiles and tanks, but sturdy alliances and enduring convictions. Power alone cannot protect us, nor does it entitle us to do as we please. Our power grows through its prudent use. Our security emanates from the justness of our cause, the force of our example, and the tempering qualities of humility and restraint. So again, very much in line with the Catholic Church's positions on the importance of international law, international institutions, things like that. I would also say that the other part of it, it says we must need to meet, to the people of poor nations, we pledge to work alongside you and make your farms flourish and clean waters flow, to nourish starved bodies and feed hungry minds. And to those nations like ours that enjoy relative plenty, we say we can no longer afford indifference to suffering outside our borders. The nation cannot prosper long when it favors only the prosperous. So a great deal of commonality with ideas of the common good, preferential option for the poor. And this is not simply principles, but has already been very rapidly translated into some dramatic shifts on policy. I'll say that it's a dramatic shift from the previous administration's Bush doctrine that emphasized unilateral U.S. military force, the preventative use of force, the idea that ethical and moral and legal considerations were a constraint on U.S. foreign policy rather than a strength of U.S. foreign policy. So this idea that you're either with us or against us, that the primary way to combat terrorism is through the military, all of that has been radically shifted in a very short time. So in policies, this has led to a very dramatic change in policy. Oh, you want me to wear this one? Okay. Bear with me. Better? Okay. As Catholics, we've never had it easy in the field of politics. Neither political party fully espouses the full range of Catholic views, so we're always left with the harder task of pursuing common ground where we find it, working to expand that common ground, and speaking prophetic truth to power where our paths diverge. And certainly that's true with what we'll be hearing about abortion policy on the domestic side. Vice President Biden is a lifelong Catholic with a strong voting record against abortion, but President Obama is on the other side of that issue. And he has said he will work to to reduce but not ban abortions. That obviously is against Catholic social teaching, and we'll see the impetus of that, the implications of that in foreign policy. But the other aspects of foreign policy that I've been tasked to discuss are much more hopeful. This common ground that I've said. For example, in the very first week, the new administration has dramatically reversed U.S. foreign policy on the war on terror, torture, Iraq, arms control, in some senses diplomacy, the Middle East. And to use one example, on torture, Bishop Howard, who is chair of the International Justice and Peace Committee of the U.S. Catholic Bishops, he, in coalition with other religious leaders and the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, asked the new administration to, this may sound familiar from the headlines of the past week, deliver an executive order that specifically bans the U.S. use of torture, makes clear that we will comply with the Geneva Conventions and the International Conventions Against Torture, and it also mandates that all U.S. Government agents will all use the U.S. Army Field Manual as a common tool for interrogation techniques. It's a stricter standard for how to do interrogation techniques. And on January 22nd, less than 2 days in office, the Obama administration did exactly what Bishop Hubbard and others had requested. Also, the new president is prioritizing brokering peace in the Middle East, also in conjunction with the suggestions of the church. On Iraq, the president has ordered a review of policy. He's already said that he was looking forward to a drawdown of U.S. forces in Iraq. The U.S. Catholic bishops and the Vatican, along with then Senator Obama, or previously State Senator Obama, were among the few voices that were very much against the war in Iraq from the beginning, that it did not meet the strict criteria of just war, tradition that was an optional preventive war rather than a necessary war of self-defense. And since then, the Vatican, the bishops, and the new administration echoes this exact same language, have called for a responsible transition in Iraq. Not a too quick pullout, but a transition that would respect the greatest safety and stability for all in the region, for Iraqis, as well as for U.S. troops. That's the exact language the new administration is using, and they're looking at a timetable of as early as 16 months to as late as 2011 for pulling U.S. troops out of Iraq. These are vast areas of common ground which, in the words of Bishop Hubbard, will help the United States to regain the moral high ground and restore our credibility within the international community at this critical time. I will just say, though, that I'm sure there will be a lot of mischief played with this issue of Iraq, a lot of criticism on both the right and the left. On the part of the left, I'm sure there will be criticism that the troops are not coming home fast enough, and I think that will be determined by the realities on the ground. On the right, I'm sure there will be criticism that the troops are coming home too fast, and in a way that in some way undermines the security of Iraq. But let me point out that prior to leaving office, the previous administration negotiated 2 agreements with the Iraqis, the Status of Forces Agreement and the Strategic Framework Agreement. And both of those agreements say that first, U.S. forces should be out of Iraqi towns and cities by June of this year. And secondly, that all U.S. forces should be out of Iraq by 2011. So the time frame that the new administration is discussing is actually the political reality. It's the ground we have to work in. It's what's already been set in motion with the agreements with the Iraqi government. So criticism on both sides may be a little bit specious in that regard. There will be struggles, however, as well. Many Americans and many in the peace community will be surprised to learn that the new administration intends to double U.S. forces in Afghanistan, from the current levels of 36,000 to over 60,000. That troops initially brought out of Iraq will be redeployed into Afghanistan. So troops will not be coming home quickly or soon. And that will be an area for continued discussion between church and state. What will the end game in Afghanistan be? That is not at all clear at this point, and so we'll have to continue our discussions. There have also been areas in which reproductive policy has entered into foreign policy. We've already seen the headlines of the revoking of the Mexico City language, which bars any groups which counsel or practice abortion from receiving U.S. overseas family planning funding. I should mention, however, that the change in that rule does not mean that groups can now receive U.S. federal funds to practice abortion abroad. That is still illegal under the Helms Amendment and has been since 1973. So this is perhaps less than meets the eye, but it is an important signal because we have the church and Catholic Relief Services and religious organizations have reached a very effective compromise on aid delivery on programs like the President's Emergency Aid Relief Program, which is saving millions of lives. And that's based on a compromise between so-called ABC policies, abstinence, be faithful, and condoms. If this is a signal of a change, that perhaps that some folks are looking to unravel or change that compromise, that could be problematic. So we certainly have to continue to be vigilant. I'd like to conclude with saying, though, as the world economy crumbles, perhaps this may be our broadest area and our deepest area for collaboration. The church and state may be able to most powerfully collaborate in protecting the world's poor and vulnerable, those who are really caught in the jaws of this economic crisis. Certainly the new administration has talked about doubling foreign assistance, has talked about beginning a $2 billion global education fund to address some of the roots of poverty and to address also to offer alternatives to extremist religious schools around the world. I would say stay tuned. That's certainly very good promises. Let's see if those become policy. And then I'd like to just return to this matter of hope that Bill has raised for us. Perhaps in this area, Benedict and Obama's visions of hope can coincide. That we can, quote, become ministers of hope. Again, that's Benedict's language, not Obama's, for our communities and for future generations. I think this may be the most fruitful common ground that we may be able to look to between our church and the new administration. The second encyclical, Saved in Hope, is titled after the words of Paul to the Romans, that hope in Christ, hope in things unseen, saves us, both individually and as community. Now, I know that that is a very different document than President Obama's political memoir, The Audacity of Hope. First of all, Oprah Winfrey did not endorse the Pope's second encyclical, as Obama's memoir was able to receive that designation. And obviously one is a very serious theological tone intended for an audience of theologians and scholars as well as the church, complete with the needed Latin and footnotes. And the other, The Audacity of Hope, is a political memoir. It's a story of how he became involved in public life, and it offers his prescriptions for where he thinks we should be going in the policy world. But you may be surprised to know that the title, The Audacity of Hope, is based on a homily that reflects on that exact same scripture passage from Paul. And Benedict and Obama reached many of the same conclusions in their two different works. Benedict preaches against hope in false sources, against hope in a narrow individualistic sense alone, and against hope in political ideologies. And instead he points to hope as that which mobilizes community action in service of God and others. That is the exact same conclusion that our new president draws to. All serious and upright human conduct is hope in action. Again, those are the words of Benedict. But we can certainly imagine the new president saying to that, amen. So I think that would be the area of common ground in which we should look to expand and till that ground together. I'll speak at the time in question and answer about how there's been changes in process in foreign policy, but I want to be respectful of the time of the other speakers. Thank you.
So that was the scriptures as mediated by Jeremiah Wright,
That's correct.
whom you neglected to mention.
I would actually say, Google that sermon, because you've certainly heard a lot of awful things about Jeremiah Wright. But it's a very beautiful sermon on the reflection on false scripture.
Well, next, we're pleased to welcome Professor Tentler. She is on our faculty, as I mentioned, of history. She is one of the more distinguished historians, U.S. Catholic historians, writing today. Before coming to us, she was a professor at the University of Michigan for some years. Her publications include texts such as Catholics and Contraception, An American History, Wage-Earning Women, Industrial Employment and Family Life in the United States from 1900 to 1930. Recently, she edited a volume called The Church Confronts Modernity, Catholicism since 1950 in the U.S., Ireland, and Quebec. And another title of hers introduces another theological quality for us today as we move through Prudence and Love and Hope. Seasons of Grace, a history of the Catholic Archdiocese of Detroit. Professor Tentler has also written, movingly, I would say, for Commonweal. Please welcome Professor Tentler.
Well, I feel so sorry for you folks in the back that I'm tempted to say there's a seat up here.
Oh, there's one right here.
There's also a sitting room up here, even though it would give the fire marshal, I'm sure, a heart attack. Well, I am a historian, as Bill said, and that means that I find the past more congenial than the future or even the present. So bear with me while I go back, briefly, I promise, to 1919. In that year, the recently organized National Catholic War Council, ancestor to the present United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, issued a series of proposals for remaking American society in the wake of the First World War. The Bishops' Program for Social Reconstruction, as it was called, included both specific reforms and what the authors called a few general principles, which should become a guide to more distant developments. Here we have the first collective effort on the part of the American bishops to bring Catholic social teaching to bear on our national politics. What specific reforms did the War Council endorse? First and most centrally, a living wage for male workers. A living wage was defined as a wage which would support a family in modest comfort and permit the accumulation of savings. All employers, according to the Bishop's program, ought to pay at least this ethical minimum. Those employers who could afford it should pay more. Second, the bishops called for state-mandated but employer-provided social insurance against illness, disability, unemployment, and old age, an early call for Social Security, in other words. Third, publicly subsidized medical care provided to those in need through municipal public health clinics. Fourth, city-sponsored slum clearance and public housing programs. Fifth, the expansion and more rigorous enforcement of workplace safety laws. Sixth, an end to child labor by means of the punitive taxation of its products, a strategy made necessary by a scandalous 1918 Supreme Court decision. Seventh, state protection of the right of workers to organize into unions and bargain collectively. And finally, apologies to Joe the plumber, a tax code that would promote a more equitable distribution of income. The bishops' program, as it was invariably called, although certain bishops at the time did not in fact support it, can be explained in part by the heavily working class composition of the American Catholic population in 1919. That's certainly something that's changed. Those bishops who supported the program wanted to demonstrate their solidarity with the working poor who filled the Catholic pews, to prevent their becoming alienated from the church, as was happening in Europe, or even, heaven forbid, their conversion to socialism, which was not yet a totally spent force in American political life. These bishops were also heirs to a body of Catholic social teaching that was as suspicious of the market as it was of the state. In the American context, in fact, with its long tradition of state neutrality in religion and the absence of a strong socialist party, the market often looked like the more dangerous entity. The bishops' program reserved its harshest criticism not for the state, not for bureaucrats, but for employers who erroneously believed that profit-making was the basic justification of business enterprise. They sound like socialists themselves to me, at least given the definition that was used in the late campaign. The bishops' program of 1919 was visionary in some respects and myopic in others. The bishops mostly ignored the wealth-generating capacity of the market and the policies that might support this. More to the point, they had nothing to say about race. Although 1919 saw a wave of murderous anti-black violence in a number of American cities. Catholic institutions at the time, of course, including this one, were mostly segregated. We might also note, as particularly relevant to present-day circumstances, an issue that's never mentioned by name in the bishops' program, but was indisputably there. The ghost issue, to which I have reference, is birth control. Something about the bishops, which the bishops were increasingly worried there was already a movement afoot to liberalize state and federal laws that limited access to contraception, but which was difficult for Catholic leaders to negotiate politically. Anti-Catholicism was still a powerful emotion in American culture and political life. Given that uncomfortable reality, the bishops had already decided that any public battle over contraception would require two things. First, non-Catholic allies, and plenty of them. And second, a set of arguments against contraception that were not specifically religious. Among those non-religious arguments was the family wage, a centerpiece of the 1919 bishops' program. A truly just society, according to the bishops, is one that pays male workers enough to support a large family in comfort and security. An unjust society pays poverty wages, forces married women into the workforce, and tells the poor to avoid having children. Catholics, of course, did eventually lose the public battle over laws pertaining to birth control. But that's not the point. The point for us is how Catholics fought that battle. Contraception might be a mortal sin. New York's Cardinal Patrick Hayes once claimed, in what I trust was an overexcited moment, that it was actually a graver sin than abortion. But Catholic leaders did not talk publicly about apocalyptic presidencies or threaten to deny communion to uncooperative Catholic politicians, even after it was clear they were losing the war. The bishops, as we've seen, instead linked the birth control issue to larger social welfare questions, to the living wage, social insurance, even abortive proposals for family allowances, things that were never realized here. They didn't push a single issue approach to politics, in other words. They always spoke a pragmatic rather than a religious or doctrinal language. Easy access to contraception was bad social policy, they argued, because It would facilitate adultery, promote a divorce culture, and encourage promiscuity among the young. You might disagree with some or all of these arguments, but you don't have to be Catholic to understand them. They consistently frame the debate in terms of values that nearly all Americans share: generosity, family solidarity, anti-materialism. Today, we clearly face a very different situation. If we look at the issues that featured in the 1919 Bishops Program, it's clear that the Democrats in 2008 did much better than the Republicans as exponents of Catholic social teaching. They weren't quite as radical as the bishops in 1919, but they were closer than the Republicans. They did better, too, on certain key issues that have more recently been of importance to the nation's bishops, immigration policy being the most conspicuous example. And yet, some American bishops were prepared to say, both in 2004 and 2008, that a vote for the Democrats was probably, or even certainly, a serious sin. I don't think that most American bishops agree with this position, as indicated by the nuanced language of the Statement on Faithful Citizenship issued in 2007 by the Bishops' Conference. But a bishop is sovereign in his own diocese, and bishops simply do not criticize one another, not publicly at any rate, and not in language that ordinary Catholics understand as criticism. The effect, whether intentionally or not, has been to suggest to a great many Americans, including, I fear, a great many Catholics, that Catholic social teaching is mainly about sex, especially since gay marriage has, for some of the more vocal bishops, joined abortion as a non-negotiable issue, and as abortion itself, in the heat of battle, has been more and more severed from a social justice context. That's what almost inevitably happens with a single-issue approach to politics. Which of the bishops who effectively endorsed John McCain had much or anything to say about those many private health insurance policies, the expanded purchase of which was the centerpiece of the McCain healthcare plan, that refused to cover pregnancy costs if a woman doesn't purchase an expensive pregnancy rider? And even with that rider, some plans deny pregnancy coverage if the pregnancy begins within 3 or 4 months of the plan's initial purchase. Now, these remarks probably sound like a stem-winding endorsement of the Democratic Party, but that isn't their purpose. I am, in fact, a Democrat, as you probably already guessed. But my party has been wrong on abortion and curiously unwilling to tolerate debate on what is surely the most complicated issue in our domestic national life. You get roundly criticized as a Democrat if you even suggest that abortion is morally problematic. I do vote as a Catholic Democrat with a reasonably clear conscience, since I believe that many of my party's policies and core values have the effect, actually or potentially, of reducing the number of abortions that take place. But I want something better, both for the party I've identified with since childhood, and for my church, which has historically been a powerful force for progress in our national life. And because of a global economic crisis, as Marianne indicated, and what is effectively a generational shift in Democratic Party leadership, I think a seamless garment approach to Catholic social teaching has a chance in this political moment to make a difference, to be heard, and perhaps, indeed, to affect public policy. I don't want us to abandon our anti-abortion position, but I do want us to insist loudly at this moment so pregnant with possibility, that's a very unfortunate I must admit, that a truly pro-life position must include support for economic justice and also for gender equity, a subject on which the bishops were conspicuously silent in 1919. The first step is for Catholics to recognize that the Obama administration is one they can't work with. No, he is not going to nominate a Supreme Court justice or justices who will vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. No Republican president, it should be noted, has managed to do this either. But even if Roe were miraculously overturned, it wouldn't mean the end of the abortion debate, simply its relocation to the 50 states, none of which, I feel confident in saying, would completely conform its law to Catholic doctrine. That is the message, folks, of the recent abortion referendum in South Dakota. So in the best of circumstances, Catholics would still have to compromise to negotiate the non-negotiable. It is time then to abandon the illusion that overturning Roe will end abortions or even appreciably reduce their numbers. As far as I'm concerned, that means abandoning a single-issue approach to politics. The exciting thing about an Obama presidency, apart from its being a vivid marker of racial progress, is Obama's openness to a new kind of liberalism. He is too young and too intelligent a politician to be mired in the categories and the resentments of the 1960s and 70s. He often talks in communitarian terms, which have a natural affinity with Catholic social teaching. His writings, his campaign speeches, even his rather somber inaugural address center on the theme of responsibility, not just for ourselves and our families, although refreshingly he insists on this, but for our fellow citizens, especially the poor and near poor. Hence the need to get serious about health care coverage for all, something that will certainly require sacrifices from the better off, but which we have neglected for so long it's a national scandal. Note that the bishops were calling for publicly subsidized health care as early as 1919. I am heartened, as a Catholic, may I say, that the stimulus package currently before the Congress includes a generous expansion of Medicaid to cover the unemployed and their families. It also includes programs that are clearly intended to evolve into the component parts of a national health insurance program. What Catholics should do at this juncture is insist that this emerging system, and it will take time to emerge, privilege children and pregnant women, which is good politics as well as good social policy. Neither children nor expectant mothers have powerful lobbies in Washington, D.C. Why shouldn't the church serve as their advocate? I can't think of a more effective way to communicate pro-life values to the country at large in language that just about everybody can understand. The stimulus package also takes seriously the need to provide assistance to the unemployed, something that the bishops were urging back in 1919. Our system of unemployment insurance, which ought to be of powerful support for family stability, has been eroding literally for decades. A much smaller percentage of the workforce is protected by unemployment insurance today than was the case in my youth. You don't need a graduate degree in public policy studies to understand that predictably stable family income is likely to reduce the abortion rate. At this juncture in our history, abortion is highly correlated with poverty. Successful anti-poverty programs are thus, almost by definition, successful anti-abortion programs as well. Other aspects of the stimulus package should also serve to reduce poverty. The education provisions, for example, which range from additional funds for Head Start to expanded assistance to college students. And the tax cuts, which are geared to the relief of modestly situated families rather than the well-to-do. Let's greatly expand the earned income tax credit while we're at it. I will confess to one area of great anxiety with regard to the next 4 years. Can we significantly strengthen our public provisions for social welfare and continue to sustain very high rates of immigration? European experience suggests that there will be difficulties in this regard. In recent years, we have economized, I put that word in quotes, by excluding legal immigrants from a number of social programs. Happily, the new Congress has just re-included the children of legal immigrants in the S-chip program. Then there's the question of what we owe in terms of social provision to illegal immigrants who are, after all, our fellow humans. Our church has historically been a generous advocate for the immigrant poor, probably the most generous advocate this country has ever seen. I hope its leaders have wisdom to offer the nation as we face a near-term future of hard choices. But our leaders cannot do that if we can't escape the trap of what can only be called culture wars.
seamless garment as a possible theme for the next administration. So perhaps it's only fitting that we turn now to the Joseph Cardinal Bernardine Professor of Catholic Social Thought at Georgetown University, Professor John Langan, S.J., who formerly held the Rose Kennedy Chair of Christian Ethics, playing musical chairs over there at Georgetown. He's associated with the Kennedy Institute and has published widely on topics in philosophy and social ethics, international affairs, human rights, just war theory. His publications include Human Rights in the Americas, The Struggle for Consensus, The American Search for Peace, Moral Reasoning, National Security, and Religious Hope, and A Moral Vision for America, an edited volume. He has also written for publications including the Journal of Religious Ethics, Commonweal, and America. I've much admired his work for many years as someone in the same field. Many virtues would describe him as a scholar. Wisdom, justice, discernment, but perhaps a relevant virtue for today would be, in his case, fortitude, since I've learned that he's been in the Society of Jesuits for something over 50 years now. He is the rector of the Jesuit community at Georgetown. Please welcome Professor John Langan.
Well, thank you very much for a very generous introduction. I was pleased by the invitation to come over across town to a university where my father studied many years ago for his PhD in chemistry, and also to deal with a largely unknown topic. The Obama administration is not quite 10 days old. I can assure you that the stands from the inaugural parade are still up on Pennsylvania Avenue. I walked past them a couple hours ago. Like most babies at 10 days old, the child is audible, but not fully articulate or defined. And so there's a lot of speculation that goes on, of the sort of, like the father, like the mother, will this be like Lyndon Johnson, undone by an interminable war, like Jimmy Carter, unable to make Washington work, like Franklin Roosevelt, called to lead us through very dark times indeed, like Abraham Lincoln, called to bring us to a new stage of interracial collaboration. These are all important possibilities which are worth thinking about. But they are all going to be constrained by what has already happened. The Obama administration's 9/11 has already occurred. It occurred in September of 2008 with the intensification of the financial crisis. And this is what ensured President Obama's election. It also constrains the possibilities as he goes forward, so that it both gives and takes away. Now, the topic of relating this new administration to the Catholic social agenda is, I think, challenging and attractive because of the size of and importance of the Catholic electorate, the movement that it shows between the two big political parties, and the fact that we're now we have probably passed through a reconfiguring election in 2008. It also struck me that the project we were asked to take on, in particular the division between the global or international and the domestic, was somewhat artificial. That so many of the issues have a way of crossing over that divide. We're also at a moment where, on the Catholic side, President Obama seems to have been at least moderately successful with Catholic voters to be receiving a distant reception from Catholic bishops, and to have at least gotten formal acknowledgement and a welcome of some warmth from Pope Benedict. Interesting diversity of responses. While we're doing, in effect, preliminary reflections on the topic, it's worth pausing for a moment just to look at what we mean by a Catholic social agenda. And I think it's worth remembering that this social agenda did not always accord such a prominent place to the life issues. Those were normally discussed in other encyclicals like Casti Connubii or Humanae Vitae. They came out of a different theological process and with different contributing authors and so on. And were presented with a different set of suppositions about the authoritative character of the teaching and its variability depending on the social, political, cultural context. But it is quite clear now that, particularly in the context of the United States, the life issues are quite clearly part of the social and political agenda of the Church. The question that I'd like you to pause to reflect on for a moment is to say, well, what would we mean by a Catholic social agenda? Is it something like a party platform with a whole series of planks which are more or less connected? Or is it something which is more tightly unified, that requires a kind of comprehensive assent across the board? Is it a clear structure of teaching, or is it a somewhat diversified set of motivational appeals? And I'm not asking you to resolve, I don't propose to resolve that, and I'm not asking you necessarily to resolve it in the short term, but to bear it in mind as a continuing consideration and question for what I'm about to say. Within the body of Catholic social teaching, there are two notions that are, I think, particularly important for getting us from the very broad considerations about the orientation of our lives toward the common good and the call to shape a community which will be in conformity with the laws of nature, but which give a kind of spin to our movement from these very general notions to the concrete specifics of political programs and issues. They're familiar, most of you will give a nod of recognition as soon as I mention them. They are solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity in the present context is bound to be an extremely important issue because the President himself raises certain issues of solidarity in a world that is marked by divisions according to ethnicity, class, religion, gender. He clearly is at a kind of meeting point just by virtue of his African and white American ancestry, and because of the way in which he has moved between predominantly African American social environments to places like Harvard Law School and the U.S. Senate. And part of the expectation of this presidency is whether he will be able to, in fact, weave together the various strands of this rich personal social experience in a way that produces solidarity among these people. This is, I think, an inescapable question about pretty much everything that he does. Whether he will be building a broader, deeper community, first of all in the United States, and then more globally. And it's worth bearing in mind that a great part of his international appeal comes from this conjunction of characteristics that he exhibits. And of course, affirming solidarity across class and cultural lines has been a crucial part of Catholic social teaching and comes out of the proclamation of the gospel itself, which is addressed to all humanity. Subsidiarity is also a familiar notion in the Catholic social tradition, certainly going back to the early 1930s. And it, on one level, can be seen as a pragmatic preference for the local and the regional over the national, for the national over the global, for the private over the public. But handling problems in the appropriate way. But this way should prevent bureaucratization and incipient totalitarianism and protect freedom and diversity. This is the kind of principle that Republican moderates are naturally drawn to. And it's a kind of structuring value for the way in which we would try to shape society to conform to the Catholic vision of what human society is called to be. What brings the subsidiarity question front and center, I think, is the financial crisis. One of the doctrines that has been called in question, not a religious doctrine, but a doctrine of, shall we say, practical wisdom in the financial marketplace, is the doctrine of too big to fail, applied to groups like Citigroup and Wachovia. This may mean too big to be handled by anybody except by the federal government. But we have obviously got ourselves into a massive financial crisis, which will disturb a lot of the established patterns of organization and cooperation, which the financial sector of our society has relied on for a long time, and which, quite candidly, it must be admitted that the financial sector has screwed up its responsibilities. And this is clearly a pervasive part of its culture. One need only look at the last-minute bonuses doled out by Merrill Lynch, which is a company that had passed through financial catastrophe, but in which the people who exercise responsibility continue to dole out to themselves an extraordinarily generous rewards. But this is going to create continuing pressures in the application of the principles of subsidiarity. Because for a person who takes the principle of subsidiarity clearly seriously, the concentration of ever more economic decision-making in the hands of the federal government, and in all likelihood in the hands of the leadership of a very small number of agencies, is a troubling prospect. This is an area where there should be healthy cooperation between public and private. And this is going to require a renewal of regulation and self-regulation, not simply massive bailouts and an emergent, sort of everything must be done in an emergency, but will require some critical scrutiny. And this is where some of the more conservative themes in Catholic social teaching can, I think, be quite relevant. If we were to try to cover the broad range of domestic issues, we'd be here a long time. And I should not run too terribly long. My colleagues have shown admirable restraint. It's safe to say that the life issues are the preponderant concern of the Catholic community. One of the questions that one should ask about this is, if one takes the Catholic position on the life issues, what follows for the rest of the political agenda? Are we called upon, in effect, to shut down thinking once we have decided which party or which politician or which group has got the right answer on this question, and then everything else becomes a kind of pass-fail, but you don't need to worry much about it, which seems to me very likely to produce extremely misleading conclusions and inaccurate results. The financial crisis is, I think, obviously for for the secular world and for American society generally, the 800-pound gorilla that needs to be dealt with. There's a wide range of solutions, and a lot of these things involve technical considerations and predictions about the future with regard to which Catholic social teaching just doesn't give you very much help. But what should continue to be affirmed as Catholics reflect on the financial crisis is the Church's teaching about the option for the poor, which, as Professor Tendler has reminded us, is not simply a kind of import from Latin America, but has deep roots in American Catholic social experience, as well as in the encyclicals of Leo XIII, Pius XI, and the familiar cast of characters. The Church, which is by and large made up of ordinary folks, needs to be a continuing advocate for the interests of the poor and the unemployed and of homeowners who are at risk. And simply preserving the institutional structure of the financial community is not enough. It is indeed, I think, necessary, but it's not sufficient for a just resolution of these problems. Besides these two, what do I call third rail issues or very hot issues, there is a wide range of sectoral issues which the administration may or may not be able to deal with, partly depending on how it successfully handles the financial crisis. Healthcare reform, where we have an ongoing challenge to achieve cost control, increased access, more rational use of resources, and where Catholic health organizations have been strong advocates for universal access. This is a clear social justice issue, and it's entangled with life issues in complex ways. Immigration, which has already been mentioned, where the internationalist character of Catholic social teaching and of the Church as a living body inclines us to be very pro-immigrant. It's also an issue on which both business and labor have very significant internal divisions. It's interesting that one of the areas where President Bush had the most convergence with Catholic social teaching was in the response to immigration. And part of that is less than morally awesome, the desire of business for inexpensive labor. But part of it also is commendable, in the sense of being open, continuing to present America as a land of open opportunity. But also, we're not dealing with unlimited resources, and the financial crisis will constrain the resources even more. There are a couple other issues that deserve at least a wave. The first of these that I'll mention will certainly be a concern for the new president, and that is the administration and the depoliticization of the administration of justice. There he will almost certainly reflect the characteristic values and concerns with their pluses and minuses of the Harvard Law School and the elite levels of the legal profession. There's also a question of science policy, the issue of climate change, and embryonic stem cell research, which again brings us back to the life question. And the Church, it seems to me, is willing, and certainly Pope Benedict has given signs of this, to move towards endorsing a kind of green agenda. But that, as our first speaker pointed out, is going to involve an enormous transformation of what a Marxist might call the forces of production and of a lot of the details of our way of life. And this will have to be carried out through democratic persuasion and leadership, which is one of the things that in which the new president gives us the most hope. So I think, the last broad sector that I'll mention is education, where I think in applying the principle of a preferential option for the poor and the priority of the needs of the poor, an approach which is much more targeted to the ongoing crisis of urban educational systems is, I think, more appropriate than an approach which relies very heavily on testing and standards. Important as that is, I don't want us to be pushed into a sharp dichotomy here. But the option for the poor and taking seriously the needs of people who are being left behind, which is a group which happens to be likely to increase over the next 18 months or so. This is something which illuminates a wide range of choices and political decisions confronting Catholics in the United States and confronting this administration. Thank you.
Is this mic on? Folks, you've been very patient. We will dispense with additional comments from the panelists at this point and turn you loose. So we're going to open the floor to questions and or comments for Professors Steinbrunner, Love, Tendler, and Langen. I'll ask you to please stand, identify yourselves, and whom you're addressing your questions or comments to. The floor is open.
Gene Salmon from Network. This is probably for all of you. Do you think we need better language than option for the poor that implies that it's optional?
Well, I think the problem with preferential option for the poor is the problem Catholics often have because we have this big family and we talk to each other, and that is that outsiders don't know what it means. I mean, you like them better than other people, you invite them to dinner. I mean, what does it mean? Why not care for the poor, concern for the poor, solidarity with the poor? That would be better.
Preference doesn't quite cut it either, does it?
Amen.
I'm the last to make any claim about political language, but my sense is that we need to introduce the idea of social equity and have it discussed, because it involves the poor, but not just the poor. And I actually think that you could argue that the crisis we're confronting here is just not just economic. It is a crisis of social equity, and it's been building for quite some time, where privilege has been concentrating at the top, and there has been a burden of degradation of life, not just among the poor, but among the middle class as well. And we have in this country an issue of social equity that does affect people who are not poor. And I think in that sense it would be a more inclusive term.
Back.
Hi, my name is Dick Dowling, and I have a question for Professor Steinbrunner. You mentioned in passing that certain forces were arrayed against the realization of the practical and moral imperatives regarding nuclear power and global warming. Could you list, and I took it you were talking about domestic opponents, could you list, the top five? Who might they be? What forces of industry or politics or academia might they be?
There is, I think it's fair to say, we have an embedded security establishment that presides over, the management of nuclear weapons and the delivery systems that deliver them, and acts like the Roman Curia once acted in terms of preserving particular, or does act in preserving doctrine. And I hesitate to, name names or even.
All right, you're amongst friends.
Yesterday I had lunch. I don't want to name names. With a colleague at the University of Maryland, a physicist, who is on a panel officially charged with providing a review of nuclear posture. and this is a woman physicist who's a technical specialist and not a policy specialist. And she was describing, if you will, the limitations of opinion prevailing in that panel and the very narrow confines of which one could even conduct arguments without being basically ejected from the panel. And that reflects not just this panel, it's an officially sponsored, but the state of the political system as a whole. Those people who have presided over policy in this area have defended, if you will, this traditional practice, which is really a massive violation of common sense. Actually, if the public checked in and knew much about it, it would not approve. And in fact, when you do polling on the subject, you discover that public attitudes are dramatically different but the public doesn't check in. And I just, one little vignette, I remember some years ago going to a senator and to trying to get said senator to introduce a very simple piece of legislation to remove one of the limitations on trying to get a negotiated reduction in nuclear forces. And he said, well, I'll do it, but I'll lose. And he said, I'm in favor, but I can't get any public attention to that, and I don't want to try because you have to scare people in order to do it, and people don't want to be scared. So what I guess I would say the number one problem is that the general public has assumed that nuclear weapons have gone away because the Cold War went away. They have no idea, literally no idea, about the state at which they, and wouldn't like it if they knew. So I would basically indict our entire political system. We have mishandled this question egregiously, really, and we're all implicated, myself included. I haven't been able to convince enough people. And that's why I'm emphasizing the need for serious engagement with the question, to broaden the discussion, to bring normal people into it, because normal people are going to certainly want a different outcome.
Yes, sir. Dave Robinson, Fox Christie USA. Just following up on the question around some of the barriers to new thinking around nuclear disarmament. I won't name names, but I'll name places. Lawrence Livermore, Sandia, the national laboratories, right? Ironically, those national laboratories are, at 90% of their budgets are weapons research. They might be doing wonderful things in the areas of alternative fuel research, but that's not what the money is that's driving those labs. And those labs got $60 billion under the Clinton administration. You put that kind of money in an institution and you really enhance its power. Ironically, if we're going to work our way out of the global warming crisis and rebuild a green infrastructure in this country, it's those laboratories that are going to have to play a huge role in providing the intellectual power behind a repowering of America. Now, what are your assessments of the chances of being able to minimize the power and leverage that the weaponeers have over the labs right now through this effort that Obama is talking about creating green jobs and creating green technologies, because you're not going to get that unless the national laboratories are deeply involved in it and restructure their priorities to reflect that?
Well, I would argue this is actually one of the more promising areas because he's appointed as Secretary of Energy one of their own who is not a weaponeer. He's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who clearly has the environmental agenda in mind. And I actually don't think it's all that difficult, conceptually anyway, to change the direction of the lab. You give them different instructions. You say, we don't, the servicing of weapons is a subordinate activity. Your main concern is the development of alternative energy technology. They would respond. The problem, of course, is Congress. You have to get Congress to go along with that. And let us hope that our new leader will be able to do that, because I actually do think that this is a very promising possibility.
Yeah, I want to talk about the money trail. And there's an estimate of $52 billion a year just to maintain the nuclear weapons complex. That's probably on the low side. Difficult to directly ascertain. There's not transparency in our budget about what's being spent on these things. But when you look at the money that's been spent for the Department of Defense over the last 8 years, it's ranged from $400 to $600 billion a year when you add in the expenditures for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think if you ask most Americans where that money was going, they would say, well, it's because of our response to 9/11, we have to spend more money to fight terrorism. But if you look at how the money is actually spent, it's not spent on counterinsurgency, on counterterrorism programs, or any of the things that you would associate with 9/11. Who has gotten all of that money? Well, it's gone to traditional weapons platforms and systems who were well poised to grab at the money when it came out. So there's been a lot of spending on traditional Navy, Air Force, etc. weapons platforms. Last I checked, Al-Qaeda doesn't have a Navy, and they don't have an Air Force. So why are we spending dramatic expenditures in those directions? And I think to change the labs, as your question goes, I think they have to see that there's a secure funding source from elsewhere. So I think it's not only a directive of this is your new marching orders, but to see that there's a funding source that can continue their activities. And after the end of the Cold War, they were very concerned that they would all go away, and it's about the money.
I'd like to add a footnote to the nuclear discussion. That is that we should notice that there was a jointly signed piece in the Wall Street Journal, unlikely place, I guess it was last year, 2007, signed by Secretary Shultz, Secretary Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, which was really calling for a zero nukes approach in the future and moving toward that. That doesn't sweep the boards by any means, but it shows that there's internal doubt and at least some pressure to consider alternatives. If we go back a generation, the Star Wars approach that President Reagan proposed originated in a profound ambivalence about the moral acceptability of nuclear deterrence. And this was felt by Admiral Watkins, among other people, and was brought, the president bought into this. So you can find support for some of these things in surprising places, and when you get people to reflect on the issues rather than simply apply partisan labels, progress can sometimes be made.
David Joubert, I'm a Catholic student here, and how do you expect for the United States to lower its nuclear armament to zero when Russia and Iran are sworn enemies of our democratic allies, and when they've repeatedly refused, well, especially Iran has repeatedly refused to put down its nuclear armament, and really just has ignored us despite embargoes and offers and things of that nature?
The story is actually more complicated than that. First of all, nobody believes that we will eliminate our nuclear weapons unless everybody else does at the same time. So it's not an issue of unilateral disarmament. Nobody's ever advocated that. I would say that with regard to Iran, actually the detailed record shows that they've made two recent efforts to say that they wish to negotiate everything. Both of which have been rejected by the outgoing Bush administration. One of the efforts was in 2003, in the wake of the Iraqi invasion, in which they now recognize terminated something like a nuclear weapon design program, suspended uranium enrichment and plutonium production, and subjected themselves to the advanced protocol inspection of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is sort of more intrusive inspection. And they did that for 2 years. And the United States did nothing in response, zero. So if you're in Iran, you would tell a very different narrative. You would say we repeatedly attempted to engage with the United States in reasonable discussion, and we have rejected. It's one of these, or the national perspectives on both sides have a difficult time corresponding with one another. But those are facts. The Iranians have made an effort, and the Bush administration rejected the effort. Whether the negotiations would have succeeded in resolving the issue is not clear because there was no attempt made. But it is not, doesn't reflect, if you will, the start, the instruction you just described.
Yes, okay.
Michael McNulty, the Conference of Major Superiors of Men. This is primarily for John Langan. Couldn't one argue that the integration of financial institutions in the United States came into tension with the principle of subsidiarity long before there was any talk of government takeover, and that really the failure was involved with a lack of vigorous antitrust enforcement?
Oh, yeah, I think you certainly could argue that way. And I mean, this is not an area in which I have particular expertise, but my sense is that this is a problem that's been building up for a generation. And there's always been a tendency for there to be speculative bubbles. But for well over a generation, there's been a sustained attack on financial regulation, and the ideology of the marketplace began to give excessive amount of unchecked power to individuals who were highly self-interested, and there were anti-competitive factors at work in this, so that it's. My point is, looking forward, I would not be happy to see investment decisions turned into simple government functions. I don't. This, I think, would in the long run have a negative effect on our economy and on our entire society.
Along those lines, my name is Phil New. I'm a graduate theology student. I understand subsidiarity to mean to allow on a grassroots level to do more. However, when they're not in a position to do that, those with greater power are also called to intervene on their behalf. So that would speak on behalf of this intervention. I'd like to extend it to an international level. As I understand, I don't know if it's in the encyclicals, but it's unmistakable in the last three popes that they would envision a worldwide regulatory body for the economy, for the financial transactions that go on. And I would think and hope that the Obama administration would be amenable to that as well. How would you relate that also to this question, not just domestically but internationally?
Yeah, that I think is on one level a fairly simple step. I mean, there's a lot of, this is a big part of what globalization is about, that there's a lot more interconnection, collaboration, so on. And that's regulated in different ways by governments, by international financial institutions. So it's not as if we're, starting from zero on that front. I think American nationalism, which is an extremely powerful force in our life, is very wary about buying into systems of regulation in which ultimate authority moves outside of our own shores. And it may be that this is a situation where the best, theoretically the best, becomes the enemy of actual practical improvement. Also, it's far from clear to me that there's an international body with enough sustained coherence and wisdom to do an effective job of regulating the world economy as such. There are just too many unresolved issues. We don't do legislation on a world basis, but we do work out agreements, regimes for handling certain ranges of problems. And this is I think a gradual process.
There are a couple more seats here. If anyone who's standing would like to sit at this point, if you're not already waiting in line for the buffet.
I guess I'd just add to that, that this is an enduring problem that we're going to see throughout our generation. This is what the topic of my books on Beyond Sovereignty have been about. That we have problems that go across borders, and we don't have laws or institutions that can adequately address those. So you're left with a piecemeal attempt to construct order and construct authority and construct institutions. The good news is I think this administration has already indicated that it is much more interested in those cooperative attempts to construct authority and to construct and abide by international law and institutions. But it's not going to be world government anytime soon, folks. And on the globalization issue, though, I think that this is a president who's deeply ambivalent about globalization, about the economic impacts of globalization on the poor. And perhaps that comes from his own upbringing, as certainly a poster child for globalization. But he's repeatedly said he would try to renegotiate NAFTA with greater emphasis on how it impacts the environment and workers. And has a lot of people concerned about that. A lot of bankers and lawyers concerned about what that would look like. Now, whether that will come to pass, I don't know, because there's many in his administration that were the architects of some of those treaties. But stay tuned.
Just a brief comment. How do you organize a world in which many of the economic effects extend beyond our legal jurisdictions and cultural affiliations? And the core of that, getting back to the issue of social equity, is that said world, which will not have formal global legislative powers, is going to be dependent upon equity principles, because that's the only way you're going to get voluntary compliance, if you will. Everybody needs coordinating rules. The rules that everybody's going to sign up to have got to be equitable. And the development of equitable principles that can command, if you will, globally, is an extremely important issue. And underdeveloped, to put it mildly, at the moment.
Who has a question for Professor Tendler? And back, thank you.
My name is Deirdre Lauder. I'm a sophomore at philosophy major here. And I wanted to ask you about, this is sort of for both you and Professor Lehner, a question about the idea, going back to the abortion issue, and the idea of regarding politics not in a single matter approach. And I guess I want to challenge that idea because, in a sense, I think we could even call, I particularly don't like calling abortion a life issue because I think it's a great understatement. And it sort of occurred to me this evening what appears to refer to it as a death issue. And I guess my question is, you can tell I'm more talk about this. If we are regarding it as part of a wider spectrum of things to consider when we're voting and when we're acting in the political spectrum, is there a danger that we are becoming complacent about it to the extent that, generation after generation is voting and pursuing politics with this in the background while there are deaths every day in the thousands? And what's the call to our conscience in that, on that, if you agree?
I guess to your question, I would say yes. There is that danger. The one argument for overturning Roe, it will not end abortion, it will not even end the abortion debate. But if at least some states embody in their new laws the message that abortion is indeed a morally troubling thing, and that there are certainly circumstances under which this state will not permit an abortion, that sends a very different signal than the current climate, which is abortion is your choice, your right. The right aspect of it, I think, has been chiseled away a bit in more recent Supreme Court decisions, but it is still there. So yes, there is that danger. I would say two things. One is that to really end abortion, which is presumably what we want, we don't really just want other people to say, yeah, you were right about it. We want them to stop having abortions. What we have to do, in essence, is persuade people that truly communitarian thinking, well, first of all, is what they want to subscribe to, but secondly, that you have to stretch the boundaries so far that you imagine as members of the human community beings we can't yet see. That's very difficult to do, and I think personally it's harder to do if you're not willing to actively support programs that will help people make the choice you want them to make. Now, you could say correctly that the pro-life movement has done some admirable things in the realm of charity. The problem is that you need justice. You need the whole society to make a commitment, and you need those services to be readily available to everyone. The second thing I would say is that politics is messy. Obviously, when you go to vote, people very seldom, if they think hard about it, are voting without at least some twinge of conscience. For me, a nice emblem of the messiness of politics is something that Roe did that almost nobody is aware of. Back in 1927, the Supreme Court issued a hideous decision in which it told the state of Virginia that women who got pregnant in state institutions who were mentally disabled or physically unfit or had some obvious impairment that had caused them to be institutionalized could in fact be compulsorily sterilized, that there was not in fact a right to have a child. Well, Roe overturned Buck v. Bell, this 1927 decision. We think of it as the decision in 1973 that gave women a right to an abortion. What it actually establishes is the right to reproductive freedom, which entails the right to have a child, as well as to abort a child. Well, if even that ghastly decision, which I deeply rue, could have a small silver lining, I guess it suggests what a messy business it is to be alive and to be human. But yes, Deirdre, you're right. There is a danger with my easy counsels, everybody become good Democrats and we'll take care of the abortion problem, by just being practical. Yeah, we might forget about it, and I am conscious of that issue.
If I could just add one further comment. A lot of the argument generated around the abortion issue has been closely connected with the single act of voting. But our political participation should be much broader than that. And you may wind up, as a pro-life voter, finding that your candidates don't get into office in various settings, and so then you have to promote your causes working through the candidates that are actually elected. And those I think should include more than simply the life issue, but so we can get we can put too much on the single decision point of voting.
Mr. Johnson. Brian Johnson, I teach moral theology here. My question would be either to the first speaker or John Lang. I noted after the new administration took office, there was another attack using drones and missiles against a house in Afghanistan, against suspected terrorists again, always suspected, which inevitably contained innocent people. So the same effect all over again, killing innocent people, alienating more Afghans. I was most disappointed to see that happening under the new administration. Would someone comment on that, please? Looks to me like a violation of non-combat immunity in a very clear way.
And one we're only going to see more of. I would submit, I think, by whomever's in office. That is the area, thank you for bringing that up in question, because we were given many, many questions to discuss, not all of which we could in the time permitted. That's one area of the war on terror that we have not seen a change. And it's partially because of the increased activity of terror cells in the border regions between Afghanistan and Pakistan where there's not effective governance. But it's also partly driven by technological advances that we didn't have 8 years ago. So there's an excellent and chilling new book out about this called Wired for War. And it talks about the ethical implications when we can do this type of killing from afar. And one of the interesting, and I'll hand this over to John because I think he has something to say on it too, but one of the interesting, unexpected consequences for the troops who are actually sitting behind a computer screen and pulling the trigger is increased post-traumatic stress disorder rather than decreased because they are actually still living their civilian life, going home to their family and their children and sitting on a computer screen watching people die each day. So there's some tremendous moral hazards here that I think we have not yet begun to unpack because we've been looking at these issues from it saves U.S. lives rather than looking at the responsibility to avoid civilian casualties.
I think it's a very serious moral and practical issue. And it will require much more extensive, much more public discussion to get anything close to a resolution. At the moment, we're doing this because we're the only country basically that can do it. If you imagine that some other country might be able to do it and might do it to us, we would be exceedingly interested, if you will, in rules to regulate this. In effect, this is summary execution. And we justify it by saying, well, it's the context of a war, but strictly speaking, this is not a war in the same sense. What's happening is that a technical capability is being operationally developed way out in front of the either the policy or the moral judgment of the community as a whole. And we've got a lot of catching up to do. All I can say is we need to talk about this, and we need to talk about, and in fact, the whole process is hurting us a great deal in Afghanistan. It's a temptation to do this, but it's almost certainly a mistake from a point of view of stabilizing the situation. And it's not going to get corrected unless there's more of a political discussion. You can't just turn it over to friend Obama to say, stop it. He's going to have a more active political discussion in order to be able to stop it, even to raise the issue about what kind of constraints ought to be imposed. This is summary murder going on, basically.
Yes, sir, in the back.
I'm Steve Colecki. I'm in the International Office at the Bishops' Conference. I have a question. I was very intrigued, Dr. Steinbrenner, with the alignment of nuclear weapons, global warming, and then you also brought in Iran there. And then Dr. Sumanulov talked about sort of some of the initial signs, including the torture thing, and then the appointment of an envoy for the Middle East. And it's the nexus of that with the first three that I'd like to talk about. I just got back from Israel and Palestine, and of course the terrible situation in Gaza and between Israel and southern Israel and so forth. It seems that conflict has a symbolic importance far beyond its immediate geopolitical sort of situation, as it were, across the entire Middle East. Also with the possibility that there's nuclear weapons involved, at least in one of the parties there, that might have some implications for why Iran would want a nuclear capability, for example. Do you see, how do you see this being played out in terms of the envoy? What are the prospects of some real progress in what is a very dire situation at the moment? And how does that fit in with being able to move forward with a sort of a nuclear non-proliferation regime that would have some sticking power within that region and so forth?
Solution for Middle East peace, John?
I'm tempted to say thank you for that question, Steve, but that would be a disingenuous comment. One naturally hopes that the issues of that in particular the nuclear materials production problem in Iran. They do say that they are not attempting to develop a nuclear weapon, and so far we really don't have definitive evidence to the contrary. That issue could be resolved without having to resolve, if you will, the Arab-Israeli the situation in Gaza and all that. But it is a question. And it is clear that those of us, Marianne included, who worry and think about civil conflict and its manifestations, that conflict that is now sort of raging, or recently raging in Gaza, represents basically the epicenter of civil conflict worldwide. And you could connect much of the civil violence directly and indirectly to that situation. And if you accept that, then it says there really is a pretty hard practical imperative for the international community as a whole to really do something about it. It is pretty obvious that the local parties cannot and will not resolve it. So doing something about it implies overriding, if you will, their current judgment, political inclination, etc., and imposing, if you will, restraint on the fighting that they themselves cannot control. To put it mildly, to even suggest that that's a thought would get you, in an earlier century, would get you burned at the stake, frankly. That's way, way, way outside the bounds of what the current American political discussion is willing to tolerate. But it's really hard to figure out how we're going to get a resolution unless the international community as a whole really does crack down on the players, both of them, all of them. It says we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We are intervening to stop it, and thereby imposing solutions that you yourselves appear to be unable to come up with. That is pretty heavy-handed. There is, however, this doctrine that's been articulated, responsibility to protect. And this would have to be the prime application of that doctrine, if it is to mean anything. Protection against the beleaguered population in Gaza has got to be the #1 mandate, if you will. And it just involves a great deal more than any of us are very willing to think about. So, no thanks for that question.
I think Alex, one more question here. We're almost at time.
Bill Antonio, Life Cycle, at least I am until I ask which is coming. Professor Tedler, in your presentation, I thought I heard you say that in the situation in which abortion is a non-negotiable, it's impossible to have a dialogue with people who might see it as problematic under some conditions. And in fact, I would go further and say there are people of reason who believe that there may be situations in which abortion is a moral choice. And but in a situation in which we're trapped into a non-negotiable, we can't have any of those dialogues. I thought Bernardine, in his establishment of a consistent ethic, thought we were capable of carrying on a dialogue across the line from beginning to end with our conference, in which you call, well, a messy society. I just wonder if you would elaborate a bit on that problematic.
Are you asking me whether I think non-negotiable is a wise term to use politically, or are you asking me a question about my views on the morality of abortion?
No, on whether or not we can afford a dialogue. In other words, is it...
We have to. Nobody, folks, nobody else out there thinks that the fetus is a person, or hardly anybody else out there thinks that the fetus is a person. And if you want to get this idea across, we, I guess is what I really mean, will have to say it, but say it in language that is A, non-threatening, that doesn't involve attacks on other people as murderers or potential murderers, and that is couched in language that doesn't go back to kind of basic Catholic theological premises, because other people do not share those. I don't think in terms of the law we're going to succeed. I do not think there's a state in this union prepared to pass a law which says abortion can happen under no circumstances. People are simply not there, and frankly, I don't think most Catholics are there either. In a larger sense, non-negotiable is not a political term. I mean, politics is about negotiation. The late Joseph Rao, long before abortion became an American political issue, used to say, you always talk no compromise in politics till you get the best deal you can. Then you compromise. And I think even with abortion, it's very painful if you do genuinely regard it as a life issue to even think about compromising. But that's the reality of life this side of the grave, I'm afraid.
I'm Teresa Walder, and I work for the Catholic University Press. And my question is, I found it shocking as a lifelong Catholic that bishops and some priests refused communion publicly to people in their parishes. I mean, utterly shocking and disturbing. And I'm wondering your comments, if there's anything the laity could do to make clear to the bishops that this isn't acceptable, since we don't see people on all these other many ultra-important issues being refused communion for their
I would want to add a word of support to what Professor Tendler was saying. I think we have gotten a very hard line on the life question, and that threatens the civility of American society. If one simply has a straight-out equation of abortion with murder, and then tries to draw all the conclusions from that, and this is not to say that abortion is justified, or that it isn't the taking of an innocent human life, but we have to recognize this is an area in which there is not a moral consensus within our society. And what's the way forward? Is it, in effect, to beat on the other side more intensively with yet more powerful rhetoric, or is it to find ways of showing respect for the fetus, but also respect for certain values that are important? Like one of the very important values for participants on the other side of this debate is the status of women and the ability of women to make decisions that intimately concern them. And a big part of the American public, while capable of recognizing the humanity of the fetus, doesn't want this decision to be taken out of the hands of women and put in the hands of courts. That's a very serious obstacle to, in effect, making the Catholic case the law of the land. And we have to show respect for the values of our fellow citizens. Simply turning them into murderers or advocates of murder or grossly insensitive people is not, I think, a way forward. The primary way of preventing abortion in our kind of society has to be through persuasion. Because unless key members of the medical and legal professions and the vast majority of women are persuaded of the immorality of this, it will simply go on. We're not talking about trying to construct nuclear weapons in your backyard. This is not by and large a high-tech activity. It's and people, again, there are shabby reasons for abortions. And people are concerned about certain kinds of respectability or costs and so on, but we have to be prepared to acknowledge integrity on the other side and to draw some of the consequences of that. I think the approach, any approach that in effect puts on local clergy the burden of denying communion to people is in the long run not workable. It's for one thing to impose a penalty without any clear judicial process, and this is going to, it's going to be applied in all probability in a very haphazard and uneven way. It is, for instance, not a practice that's been undertaken by bishops in Europe, where pro-choice politicians have openly received communion from highly placed figures in the church. We will have problems of consistency and fairness. So this is not to say that these people shouldn't be challenged, but I think the bishops backed into this as a way of expressing their profound disapproval for abortion and for pro-choice politicians. But there was not a shared deliberation about the implications of this. But now the difficulty, frankly, is that the bishops who got into this situation are among the people least likely to be responsive to lay criticism, and they're not prime candidates for intra-ecclesial. They have a clear understanding, and they are also on their own terms men of conscience, and they have something of the zeal of a crusade. But again, all of us have to contribute to lowering the temperature and trying to proceed in a way that is more marked by both faith and charity.
I know we're over time, and it's probably terrible to add one more thing, but I would add to the council that we're often turning away potential friends by assuming that they're always enemies. So we're not engaging in dialogue where we should. But just to the flip side, as a political scientist who's sufficiently cynical here in Washington, D.C., we're also assuming people to be our friends who may actually be our enemies politically. Lyndon Johnson used to like to say, who was a great legislator, do you want a solution or do you want the issue? And there are some pro-life politicians who will want the issue. They don't want it to go away because it will help them in election and will help them to mobilize the base. So while we're talking about challenging pro-choice politicians, I think we also have to look hard at challenging so-called pro-life politicians. Why have we had Republican majorities in both houses of Congress, in the presidency, and in the court, and had no movement on these issues other than at the margins? Well, can we spend $480 on groups that talk about this abroad, but not really addressing the issue at home? I think the reason that we see that issue so marginalized and we only have a debate about funding abroad is because there are many politicians who like to be reelected. I know that's shocking. But we have to think more critically.
I want to be clear that I'm not pulling the plug on this discussion right now. But we are over time, and we have more questions that we can get to. So I am going to suggest that we adjourn. I would like to thank Steve Schneck and Marianne Love, who's very kind to us. I also want to thank the staff, Lucia and Josh, and the rest of the staff who've helped put this together. And finally, a warm thanks for our panelists, and you all are heartily invited to join us for reception afterwards. Thank you.
Let me say, too, before you all leave, all of this will be available on the Life Cycle website for downloading at your convenience.